What's up, guys? Happy Wednesday, happy sales data day. We got US numbers in, so there's a lot to talk about. And I know for most of my videos, you guys just like to listen in the background, but I'm gonna throw charts and numbers and graphs on the screen. I'm gonna include some sources for this one, just because I know that's like the biggest criticism I get. I treat this like just a channel for me to speak to, and people want me just to put more sources and more numbers on the screen, which is fair. I always mention them, I say how to find them, but I don't necessarily share them or show them on the screen just because I don't really have the time for it, but I've allotted a lot of time for this video, so hopefully it comes out good. And I'm just gonna take like the next 20 seconds to swing two things out of the way very quickly. I'm gonna shamelessly plug my 2.5-hour retrospective for Banjo-Kazooie on my alternate channel. I uploaded it late last night. I know a lot of you already got to it, but for those of you that haven't, I've been saying for a month that I've been working on it, and I finally got it done. So yeah, it's up there right now on Nintendo Plus. Outside of that, the next big talking point is Final Fantasy VII. People have been calling me out for the past month saying, hey, why don't you mention Final Fantasy VII? Why don't you mention Final Fantasy VII? And quite frankly, I didn't mention it because I didn't believe any of the news about it, especially since initial sources were saying 60 frames per second, and then those same sources dropped down and said it looks great, it runs at a clear 40 frames per second. And then now, the greatest source of all, the people that actually made the game, have told everybody that it goes at 30 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch 2. Not that it matters that much to the people that I need to tell this to, but you know how it starts off. First, 60 frames per second, Switch 2's phenomenal. Then 40 frames per second. It's a handheld console. What do you expect? This is great. It's more than 30. And then now they're going to be like, well, I mean, it's 30 frames per second and it looks gorgeous on the Switch 2, so it's still worth it. But yeah, I just wanted to get that out of the way because I didn't want to make a whole nother video discussing Final Fantasy VII. The gold standard that everybody has been mentioning for the past few days runs at 30 frames per second. Okay, let's get started on the juicy stuff. Per the Circana numbers, the Switch 2 has surpassed 2 million units as of the end of July. The report is that it is roughly 75% higher than the Nintendo Switch 1 in that same time frame, so basically when the Switch 1 launched in March going through April. I made a post about this earlier today, but in that same time frame from the first month and the entirety of the second month, the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 5 were just behind it, and we're talking about a fairly negligible difference in sales. This of course comes off the back of the first month where the PlayStation 5 and the PlayStation 4 basically sold almost everything that they had in that first month in those first 24 hours. Which means that giant and massive over 30% lead through the end of June has now shrunk to less than 10%. Actually less than 5% in comparison to the PS4. Now obviously there are very many caveats here. This is not apples to apples. First off, the PlayStation 5 and the PlayStation 4 both launched in late November, so this includes the holiday season, which gives them that holiday Christmas bump. This is the most important thing that people are going to mention when you talk about how close the sales numbers are at this time between the PlayStation consoles and Nintendo. And it is true to an extent. But as we've seen from the launch of the Nintendo Switch, as well as the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2, and even dating way back to the launch of the Dreamcast, when a new console launches, it sells out. If anything, it's actually a better idea to not launch your console in the holidays because later on when the holidays come around, you get the holiday bump. Consoles that launch in the holiday don't actually get a holiday bunch until the following year, because in the first holiday, they're just selling out what they're making regardless of what's available. And the smartest people that figured this out before anybody else was Nintendo when they released their consoles in 2017. And even with the 3DS, it was the same idea, although admittedly they had to drop the price. But what we saw with the Switch 1 is that it remained sold out for months after it released, and then they brought a lot more units available by the time we got to the holiday season, and that's a large reason why so many sales were made, plus the fact that it was very affordable, obviously. And mind you, we're going to see a bump with the Switch 2. I don't think it's gonna double its numbers the way the Switch 1 did, but we're gonna see a holiday bump for the Switch 2. And I'll take even a step further. By next month, the Switch 2's gap between the other consoles is going to be even larger, but it's strictly because by the time the holidays finished for the Sony consoles, they were out of stock. The Switch 2 still has stock. But we're gonna circle back with my assumptions of what might happen in the future at the very end. So that's our very long first caveat. The Sony consoles sold during the holiday season. That's an advantage for the Sony consoles, sure. Now, in addition to that, the Switch 2 was a genius release because it released right before Father's Day, which also was a massive advantage for that, but it's not Christmas, right? So we're not going to compare it to that. Okay, and in addition to that, the Switch 2 also has more units available, and the launch of a console is when something is the most hype that it's ever been, and yes, by the end of July, it's still considered the launch window of the console, and if the PlayStation 5 and the PlayStation 4 had more units available up until that point in time, they realistically would have had a much larger lead over the Switch 2, and it would paint a very different picture, but those are assumptions, it's not true, that's fine, we can also ignore that advantage that the Switch has. Just like we can also ignore the advantage that what the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 5 accomplished is the same as what the Switch 2 accomplished, but they did it with about a third of a month less time because their consoles were launched in the middle of the month as opposed to the beginning of the month. So technically, if you extrapolate it out, the two PlayStation consoles have sold faster than the Switch 2. But again, fine, we can ignore that advantage as well. It's all about the numbers based off the month. It's not Sony's fault they decided to release it halfway through the month. And then we can also ignore the caveat that Sony was going head-to-head with Microsoft, which in the States was actually very close, especially at launch, whereas Nintendo is only competing against nobody. Actually, that's not true. They're competing against their own fan base. All they had to do was convince people to like their console and they would have bought it, but there are so many people that didn't buy the console and that's why it's not sold out right now, but fine, we can also ignore that caveat. Now, this is part of the reality. The number is actually less than I expected. I was thinking around 2.3, 2.2 million, but I wasn't too far off. Number 2, through the second half of July, it largely carried the sales of the Switch 2 because that's when it became very easy to buy online everywhere. So actually, if they didn't withhold stock for as long as they did, the July numbers could have been even higher, but they had to save some of them for August. And likewise, those first 10-ish days of August, that's when every single store was still selling out their stock very quickly, and seemingly it started to slow down pretty quickly after that, because somewhere around mid-August is around the time where demand was satiated. So we know that June was massive because they had stock available. And of course, because Fanatics buy in on the first month, they basically sold out in June, even though it took longer than it should have. And then we know that in July, that's when these things just became available no matter how much you were buying. You could put multiple Switches in your cart and still buy them. So this July number is good, but it's still very much a hyped up manufactured good number. In my opinion, I think August should match July. Now that being said, I also expected that the Switch 2 would hit close to 2.3-ish million, like I said earlier, so I could very much be overestimating how well it does in August as well. But unfortunately, we're gonna have to wait like 2 more months until we get more August numbers from Circana, so it'll be quite a while until we can actually figure that out. The big thing that everybody's eyes should be on going forward is September. Switch 2 momentum, Switch 2 news, everything Switch 2 related is all on a downward spiral. Everybody is talking about how bad this thing is. The only people that think that it's doing well are the people within their bubbles, but at this point in time, even people that bought the thing are like, what the hell am I supposed to do with this? And they can't recommend it to anybody. And in my humblest of opinions, I don't think that changes without something as massive as a 3D Mario. That's a new 3D Mario, not a re-release of Mario Galaxy 2. And the only thing that could measure up to that is like Smash Brothers or Zelda. And I don't know, I don't feel like we're getting either of those this year. I'll tell you what, if Nintendo announces a 3D Mario, I probably will give up at that point. I'll tell you that there's no chance that the Switch 2 fails. Because the reality is Bonanza is not going to carry the Switch 2 to success. And now people will point out that Bonanza is on like 3rd place over the past month and it's like number 20 in the entire year. But like, first of all, we don't have actual numbers of what were sold. But what we do know from Matt Piscatella is that the 1st and 2nd place games are significantly further ahead from Donkey Kong Bonanza to the point that it doesn't even matter if we don't have the digital data for how well Bonanza did. We know that those rankings are not changing. And like, let's be real, there were only 2 million Switch 2 sold in the United States at this point in time. Bonanza is not going to sell as much as Odyssey did, nor Breath of the Wild. So we shouldn't expect that this is going to be the game that carries the Switch 2 to success. It's doing well at this all-time low of a video game industry at this very point in time, but it's definitely not moving units the way that the Switch 1 games did. Speaking of the Switch 1, obviously the gap between the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 is huge, but you also have to remember that the Switch 1 gained more and more popularity as time went on, the Switch 2 is losing popularity as time goes on, and the Switch 1 was very supply constrained up until like that first holiday season. The Switch 2 has had no issues with stock, and of course the Switch 1 was coming off of the Wii U, which was embarrassing, and everybody thought that Nintendo was going to fail and go third party. The Switch 2 is coming off one of the most successful consoles of all time, and as long as they just stayed the same, they would be doing much better right now. But they have a large enough following and a large enough amount of stock where it's going to look good no matter how bad they perform. I've said this before, but I expect by September 30th, the Switch 2 sales numbers should match roughly what the Switch 1 sales numbers were. As in both of them, in their launch year, by the time they get to September 30th, they should be roughly 7 to 8 million. At that point in time, during the holidays, people doubled the number of the Switch 1. I do not expect it to even be remotely as close as that with the Switch 2. And obviously, as everybody says, those holidays are going to be the big thing to look at about whether or not this thing ends up being a flop or if it just remains average and underwhelming like it is right now. But I do think it's kind of funny because of how massive this console was, and people are still kind of carrying on this idea of like fastest selling console. But despite the fact that it was so top heavy early on, those leads are starting to shrink. Through like the first week, it started off as the best-selling console in Japan, and then right now it's been overtaken by the Game Boy Advance already, and its humongous lead over the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 is now all but dissipated. And this is on a console's launch window with zero supply constraint issues. The numbers are just going to continue to slowly drop downwards until they eventually pop up a little bit on the holidays. And then again, barring that massive announcement in September, after the holidays, what else are they going to do? They're not going to sell anything for the second half of the Switch's first year. So they really got to hope that they get close to that 15 million forecast number by the end of the holidays. Now also, now that we have some official numbers in, I can kind of make a better assessment on some of the predictions I had made earlier. At this point in time, we know that worldwide, the Nintendo Switch 2 had sold 6 million units in 7 weeks. According to Famitsu sales, by the end of July, the Switch 2 had sold 1.7 million units. It was higher than that, but then they had to make the adjustment when they got it wrong on the launch month, and it turned out that the Switch 2 was not the fastest selling console in Japan. So they had to make the adjustment downwards, but basically by the end of July, it's pretty much agreed that the Switch 2 was at 1.7 million units in Japan. And if you take off that final week of July in order to get it at the 7-week mark where 6 million units were sold, you're looking at right around the ballpark of 1.65 million units, maybe 1.64. So assuming that the Switch 2 was selling out through the month of June in Japan, which it realistically was, of that 6 million that was sold through the first 7 weeks of the Switch 2's life, 0.37 million of that, so 370,000 units, was in July. In addition to that, based off of all the data we've gotten from the Circana numbers, they had that 1.1 million sold in the first 4 days or whatever it was. And since then, they've sold 0.98 million. So you're looking at a rough average of 125-ish thousand units sold a week since the console launched. So if you extrapolate it out to that first 7 weeks, it should get you close to that 750,000 mark. So we're gonna add that 0.75 to that 1.1 million, which means we're sitting at roughly that 1.85 million mark that was sold in the US. Which is funny because I think a few weeks ago, that's literally exactly the number that I had predicted for the US sales. I could be off, but it was pretty close. But anyway, per the Circana data, we know through the end of June, it was at like 1.6 million. So that's at least 250,000 units that were sold in July from that 6 million. So you got the 0.37 that was sold in July in Japan, the 250,000 units that were sold in the United States. So if you subtract those two numbers alone from the 6 million that was sold through the first 7 weeks of the Switch 2's life, because we're trying to remove the July sales, we find that in June, at most, the Switch 2 had hit 5.38 million units. And mind you, that's with the consideration that the July sales from Circana start from July 6th. So June is actually getting an additional 5 days worth of sales here based off of these numbers, so it's actually a little bit less than 5.38. Now, why does this matter? Number one, if you look at the sell-through numbers versus the sell-in numbers, a lot of the arguments I was making a while back about how much better the Switch 2 was doing in Japan versus in the US still hold very well. You're looking at 1.7 million units sold in Japan through the end of July and 2 million units sold in the US through the end of July. It's a lot closer than people think, and that's important because the Switch 2 is cheaper in Japan than it is in the US. What happened was when Nintendo released their end of June financials, it showed that the Americas had sold 2.08 million units, and Japan was only at 1.27. So everybody started laughing at me because they're like, oh, look at that. You were assuming that Japan was doing much better than it actually was. Because I kept suggesting that Japan was closer to 1 in every 3 people that were buying the Switch 2, which is not a good ratio because it means that the thing favors Japan more than the regions that it makes more money on usually. And so if you look at the financials and you take 1.27 and you divide it by 5.82, it looks like that only 1 in every 5-ish people are buying the Switch 2 in Japan. And it highlights a huge difference between how many people are buying it in the West versus over there. And at the time I said, 5.82 million is sell-in. Those are the numbers that are being shipped. That's not what's being sold to the person. Here we sit 1 month later, and the numbers show that it's a lot closer than what you might expect. Of that 6 million, based off of this math, the US makes up roughly 30% of it, and Japan makes up 27% of it. That gap's gonna keep shrinking the more units get sold in Japan, because they flooded the hell out of the US market. And they had to, in order to make their sell-in numbers make it seem like that they sold more than 5 million. Right now, I just showed that of that 6 million, if you minus the July numbers strictly for Japan and for the United States, you're at 5.38 million. Together, Japan and USA make up 57% of the entire world when it comes to Switch 2 numbers. Again, from that 6 million. And based off of most people's assumptions, the 2 most high in demand locations that have sold the best through those first 7 weeks are Japan and the United States, and much more so in Japan, with the demand being higher there. So basically what I'm trying to get at is that if you just account the July sales only for Japan and America and you subtract them and you're at 5.38 million, and they make up 57% of the sales numbers of the Switch 2 for that 6 million number, then at that point, realistically, over the rest of the world, which makes up 43%, should realistically bring that 5.38 million down another 0.47. Which means that the Switch 2 would be at 4.91 million, which again is roughly the exact number that I was predicting that the Switch 2 had sold in June. I'll give you a second to rewind the video and go through how I just went through all those numbers again, because I know a lot of you are going to sit there and be like, mental gymnastics, it's mathematics. But yeah, the whole point of those last few minutes was, number one, that the Switch 2 is selling much better in Japan than people thought after the 1 month numbers came out. Primarily much better in Japan in relation to the rest of the world, because of course it's going to do better in Japan. They're selling it at a reasonable price that everybody else is subsidizing for them. And number two, just to further back my point that if the Switch 2 had actually hit 5 million units by the end of June, which is what everybody and their mother was saying it would hit, including all of the analysts, Nintendo clearly would have said we sold 5 million units by the end of June instead of having to round up all the way to the 7-week mark to have 6 million sold through. Did I get everything on my sticky note? I think I got everything on my sticky note. I hope you guys were able to follow along. I spent a lot of time trying to make things clear on the screen, and I don't know, I'm not really a teacher, so I can't put this properly. But I hope it made a little bit of sense. Anyway, long story short, the reason I'm still covering this thing is because it continues to follow my projections personally. And as it stands right now, just like I've been saying for the past couple months now, it's dwindling. And until I get to the point where I no longer think the Switch 2 hype is dwindling away and it's gonna completely succeed, I'm gonna keep covering this because, quite frankly, somebody should, and because Nintendo deserves it. At the very least, worst case scenario, when the time comes for me to put my hands up and be like, you know what, I was wrong, at least we all made a lot of friends along the way, right? Actually, you know what? One final point before I get out of here. This whole idea and this narrative that people are trying to shift it to make it seem like nobody's actually pushing back against the Switch, and that clearly Nintendo is doing nothing wrong, and clearly nobody's actually upset by this, and everybody that wanted to buy a Switch has bought a Switch. It's based off the idea that these numbers are just too high for that to be true. Like, people have been jumping to conclusions since the day that the console launched and being like, well, clearly it's just a very small bubble of people that are actually upset. And part of the reason all of this is being shrugged off is because the Switch 2 numbers are higher than anything we've ever seen before. And of course they are, because there's never been that many numbers available at a console launch. There has definitely been this much demand before. What there has never been is this much supply before. And right now people are seeing this 2 million number and they're assuming that's like the peak. That's the best you can do. There is no way you can get more than 2 million people to buy into a console and have it reach 2 million sales, because they're not going to get 2 million people to buy video games in like a span of 2 months. Or rather, you're not going to get significantly more than 2 million. But I mentioned this earlier, the PlayStation 5 and the PlayStation 4 were both running against the Xbox when they launched. During those console launches, you very clearly had 3.5 to 4 million people running to the store to buy a console. And you might be like, well, you're comparing 2 console launches to 1. And while yes, that is correct, but the difference is the Xbox and PlayStation fandom have so much more synergy between them. There's so much more similarities between those 2 consoles that you can almost guarantee that if one of them was not being sold, the other one would get all of the sales. The Switch 2 doesn't have that competition. It's getting the entirety of that market. And if you consider the fact that if you add up the PlayStation 4 sales with the Xbox One sales, together they're only slightly ahead of what the Nintendo Switch 1 was able to accomplish. And what's even more interesting, because it happened more recently, if you add up the launch numbers of the Xbox Series console with the PlayStation 5, their current sales numbers 5 years down the line are almost exactly what the Switch 1 was at. Now, obviously, the Nintendo Switch 1 was phenomenal. It outperformed everything that nobody expected. It started off very slow, and it just continued to build. And Nintendo absolutely killed all of that momentum. Because if Nintendo wasn't price gouging, if they weren't doing all of these draconian practices, if they weren't so scummy to their customers, those numbers that you're seeing, the PlayStation 5 plus Xbox Series numbers, the PS4 plus the Xbox One numbers, those numbers easily would have been hit. And you can't even say there's limited stock, because the stock is still available in stores. Very easily, if Nintendo had come into this discussion and they weren't trying to overcharge on every single thing related to the Switch 2, we'd absolutely be talking about 3.5 million plus sales right now for the Nintendo Switch 2. Because coming off of the Switch 1's success with absolutely zero competition up against it, I firmly believe Nintendo alone could equal or do better than Xbox and PlayStation did in their launch. And I believe that because the Switch 1 was able to do what Xbox Xbox and PlayStation were able to do between the PS4 generation as well as the PS5 generation. I'm convinced that momentum specifically was stopped dead in its tracks. And I'm not saying they're not going to regain that momentum, nor am I saying that the Switch 2 is going to fail. It's obviously way too soon to say something like that. But it's so obvious. If Nintendo was just normal, they easily would have had the numbers of the Xbox and PlayStation combined. Easily. But instead they decided to be greedy as hell.